Don't trust the map when the mercury plummets. A lethal spectral cabin is waiting to manifest in the freezing mist. Those who've been trapped inside report that the only way to survive is to follow impossible freezing rules before the sun rises. We're breaking down the harrowing evidence of this phenomenon before it disappears again with the morning thaw. Daniel Voss should have turned back the moment his breath stopped forming clouds in the air. It was a detail so subtle that his conscious mind didn't register it at first, but his body knew something had gone catastrophically wrong. He'd been hiking the Cascade Ridge Trail for 3 hours when the temperature collapsed around him like a physical force. One moment, the November air hovered at a crisp 28 degrees. The next, his exposed skin began screaming warnings that the world had transformed into something hostile and alien. The thermometer clipped to his pack read -12 degrees Fahrenheit. Daniel stared at the digital display, convinced it had malfunctioned. The sun still hung in the sky, bright and mocking. No storm clouds gathered overhead. No wind screamed through the trees. The temperature had simply dropped 40 degrees in the span of 3 heartbeats, as if the universe had decided to skip several hours of gradual cooling and plunge straight into the killing cold. His fingers were already losing sensation. Daniel fumbled for his phone, but the screen had gone black, the battery drained by the sudden cold despite showing 70% charge moments earlier. The emergency beacon in his pack produced nothing but a weak red blink before dying completely. Every piece of technology he carried had been murdered by the inexplicable freeze. That's when he saw it through the trees. The cabin sat in a small clearing 50 yards ahead, and Daniel's first thought was gratitude so intense it nearly brought him to his knees. The structure looked solid and welcoming, built from dark timber with a stone chimney that promised warmth. Light glowed in the windows, a soft amber that spoke of fire and safety. Smoke should have been rising from that chimney, but the air above it remained perfectly still and clear. Daniel's survival training whispered warnings his desperate body refused to hear. Cabins didn't simply appear. He'd hiked this trail a dozen times, had studied the topographical maps obsessively. No structure existed in this area. The nearest ranger station sat 7 miles north, and the old hunting lodges had all been demolished years ago. This cabin had no right to exist, and yet his boots were already carrying him toward it, driven by the basic human instinct to seek shelter from the killing cold. The door opened smoothly under his frost-numbed hand, swinging inward without a sound. Warmth should have rushed out to greet him. It didn't. The interior of the cabin felt exactly as cold as the forest behind him, despite the fire that crackled merrily in the stone hearth. Daniel stepped inside, and the door swung shut with a soft click that somehow carried the weight of finality. The interior of the cabin was meticulously decorated. A thick rug covered the wooden floor. Comfortable chairs sat arranged around the fireplace. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books whose spines bore no titles. A small kitchen area occupied one corner, complete with a cast-iron stove and copper pots hanging from hooks. Everything looked perfect, inviting, and completely wrong. Daniel approached the fireplace, desperate for warmth. He extended his hands towards the dancing flames, close enough that he should have felt heat radiating from the logs. His skin remained numb and cold. The fire gave off light but no warmth whatsoever, as if it existed in some dimension adjacent to his own, visible but fundamentally unreachable. He spun toward the door, intending to leave immediately, and his heart stuttered in his chest. The interior surface of the door was smooth wood, beautiful and crafted with obvious skill. It had no handle, no knob, no latch of any kind. Daniel's fingers scrambled across the wood, searching for any mechanism that would allow him to open it. He found nothing but seamless timber, as if the door had been built to open only from the outside. The windows were his next hope. Daniel rushed to the nearest one, where firelight continued to glow warm and false. His hands met glass so cold it burned his skin. Through the pane he could see the forest, the trail, the world he'd left behind only moments ago. He grabbed one of the copper pots from the kitchen and swung it hard against the window. The metal rang with a clear note, but the glass didn't crack, didn't even shudder. It was like striking a pot against solid stone. Panic set in then, true and absolute. Daniel's breath came in rapid gasps that should have fogged in the freezing air, but didn't. He checked his watch and saw that time was still moving forward, the seconds ticking past with mechanical precision. 4:15 in the afternoon. Sunset would come in less than 2 hours. He had no food beyond the protein bar in his jacket pocket, no water except the bottle that had already frozen solid, no way to call for help, no way to break free. He forced himself to stop and think. The cabin was a trap, clearly, but traps served purposes. They were built with intent. Something wanted him here, confined in this impossible space where fire gave no heat and doors refused to open. The question wasn't why he was trapped. The question was what would happen when night fell and the temperature outside dropped even further. Daniel began a methodical search of the cabin, looking for anything that might offer a clue or a tool for escape. The books on the shelves opened to blank pages. The drawers in the kitchen held nothing but empty darkness. The cupboards stood bare except for dust that his fingers passed through without disturbing, as if even the dirt in this place wasn't quite real. But in the back corner, hidden behind one of the comfortable chairs, Daniel found something that stopped his heart. Deep gouges scored the wooden wall, carved by desperate fingers or maybe something harder. They formed words, rough and uneven, written by someone who knew their time was running out. The message was simple and terrifying. The cold isn't trying to kill you, it's trying to keep you. When you stop shivering, you're already gone. Daniel's body was still shivering. That was good. That meant he was still fighting. But the temperature inside the cabin continued to drop, degree by inexorable degree, and the sun outside the unbreakable windows had begun its descent toward the horizon. Whatever this place was, whatever it wanted, Daniel had to figure out the rules before his body gave out, because one thing had become absolutely clear. People had been trapped here before, and judging by the old gouges in the wood, they hadn't found a way out. Daniel Voss wasn't the first person to stumble into the phantom cabin, and the testimonies of those who came before him paint a picture far more disturbing than simple architectural impossibility. Over the past 15 years, at least 7 hikers have reported experiences nearly identical to Daniel's, all occurring during sudden, unexplained temperature drops in remote wilderness areas. What makes these accounts particularly unsettling is the consistency of details across stories told by people who had no contact with each other and no knowledge of the other's experiences. Rebecca Winters emerged from the Adirondack wilderness in January 2019 after being missing for 6 days. She was found wandering a highway 30 miles from where she'd last been seen, suffering from severe frostbite and hypothermia despite wearing adequate winter gear. Her rescue was considered miraculous. Her story was considered impossible. The audio recording from her hospital bed, obtained through a Freedom of Information request, reveals a woman struggling to articulate an experience that defied explanation. Her voice shakes not from cold, but from the memory of it. The cabin appeared after the temperature dropped. I know how that sounds, but I watched it happen. One moment there were just trees and snow, and then the air started to shimmer like heat waves, except everything was freezing. The cabin just solidified, like it had been there all along and I was only just allowed to see it. Rebecca described the same details Daniel would encounter years later: the welcoming exterior, the fire that gave no heat, the door that opened from only one direction. But her testimony adds another layer of horror that Daniel had not yet discovered. Time inside the cabin moved differently. What felt like 6 days to Rebecca translated to only 14 hours in the outside world. She aged during those subjective days, her body experiencing the full biological impact of the time she perceived, even though the physical universe measured far fewer hours. Thomas Chen's written account, published in a hiking forum under an anonymous username before being deleted, describes similar temporal distortion. I watched the sun set and rise 3 times through those windows. I counted 72 hours, but when I finally escaped, when I got back to my car, the dashboard clock showed I'd only been gone since the previous afternoon. My watch had stopped at the moment I entered the cabin. It never worked again after that. What's particularly chilling about Thomas's account is his description of the other presences in the cabin. I wasn't alone in there. I could hear someone else moving in the room above me, even though when I looked outside, the cabin was clearly a single-story structure. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. Sometimes they'd pause right above where I was standing, as if whoever was up there was listening to me the same way I was listening to them. The psychological deterioration described across multiple testimonies follows a predictable pattern. Initial panic gives way to methodical problem solving. Survivors report trying everything to break free, dismantling furniture to use as battering rams, attempting to start actual fires to burn their way out, even trying to dig through the wooden floor. Nothing worked. The cabin's structure proved impervious to any form of damage. Tools bent. Wood refused to splinter. The glass windows remained pristine no matter how violently they were struck. Then comes the acceptance phase, the moment trapped individuals realize they might die in this place. Several survivors describe experiencing vivid hallucinations during this period, visions of loved ones appearing to offer comfort, memories becoming so intense they felt more real than the cabin itself. Dr. Patricia Valdez, who survived her own encounter with the structure in 2021, believes this is the cabin's true purpose revealing itself. It's feeding on something, not our bodies, our heat maybe, or our fear. I felt it draining away whatever makes us fundamentally alive. The longer I stayed, the less I felt like myself. My thoughts became slower, my emotions dulled. It was like being gently erased 1 degree at a time. Dr. Valdez's background in theoretical biology lends credibility to her observations. She describes taking mental notes throughout her ordeal, forcing her scientific mind to analyze the experience as she suffered through it. The cabin maintains a precise temperature, exactly -18 degrees Celsius, never varying by more than 1/10 of a degree. That kind of precision doesn't occur naturally. It's being maintained, regulated, like the inside of an incubator designed for something that thrives in extreme cold. The most disturbing testimony comes from Michael Torres, who spent what he perceived as 4 days in a cabin manifestation in Montana. His account, recorded by park rangers who found him, includes details that other survivors refused to discuss publicly. On the 3rd day, I started to see them, the others who didn't get out. They're still there, inside the walls. Not ghosts exactly, more like impressions, frozen moments of people who gave up, who stopped fighting. The cabin absorbed them. They became part of its structure. Michael's claim seems to border on delusion until you examine the photographs he managed to take before his phone died. Enhanced analysis of these images reveals shadowy shapes within the wood grain of the walls, patterns that bear disturbing resemblance to human faces frozen in silent screams. Experts dismiss these as pareidolia, the human tendency to see faces in random patterns, but Michael insists otherwise. They were trying to warn me. Their mouths were moving, trying to tell me something. I think they were explaining the rules, how to escape, but I couldn't hear them through the wood. Every survivor reports the same desperate realization at some point during their imprisonment. The cabin has rules, unwritten, inexplicable rules that govern its behavior. Breaking these rules means death. Following them means a chance at escape. But discovering what those rules are requires experimentation that could prove fatal. Common elements emerge from the testimonies. Never eat anything found in the cabin, though survivors report finding food that appears fresh and appealing. Never sleep in the beds, even when exhaustion threatens to overwhelm you. Never speak the names of loved ones aloud within the walls. Never accept the warmth if the fire suddenly starts producing heat. These rules were learned through trial and error by those who came before, paid for in suffering and close calls with permanent entrapment. The most critical rule, the one that every survivor eventually discovered, relates to movement. The cabin tracks your position constantly. Survivors describe a sensation of being watched, of attention focused on them from every angle simultaneously. Stand still for too long, and the cold intensifies around you specifically, as if the building is concentrating its draining effect on your stationary form. Keep moving, keep circulating through the rooms, and the effect disperses. It's exhausting, maddening, but necessary for survival. Jennifer Oakes, who survived a cabin encounter in 2022, puts it most succinctly. The cabin is patient. It can wait. It exists outside normal time, so hours or days mean nothing to it. It will drain you slowly, carefully, making sure you experience every moment of your dissolution. The only way to fight back is to refuse to surrender, to keep your body in motion, even when every cell screams for rest. Because the moment you stop, the moment you give up, the cabin wins, and it always gets what it wants in the end. The survivors share one more commonality beyond their experiences. None of them can tolerate extreme cold anymore. Even mild winter days leave them shivering and anxious. Several have relocated to warmer climates, unable to bear the psychological weight of temperatures that might summon the cabin again. They check weather forecasts obsessively, tracking temperature drops with the vigilance of people who know that somewhere in the frozen wilderness, a predatory structure is waiting for conditions to align, waiting to manifest, waiting to trap someone new. And the truly terrifying part? Despite all these testimonies, despite the consistent details across independent accounts, no physical evidence of the cabin has ever been documented. No photographs of the exterior exist. No satellite imagery captures it. Search parties sent to the exact coordinates where survivors claim to have been trapped find nothing but empty forest and undisturbed snow. The cabin appears, traps, and vanishes without leaving a trace in the physical world. Only the survivors remain as proof, carrying scars both physical and psychological that insist something impossible happened to them in the depths of winter's darkest cold. The cabin operates according to laws that seem designed specifically to torment human intuition. Every instinct that normally keeps a person alive becomes a potential death sentence within its walls. The rules aren't posted anywhere. They aren't explained by any helpful guide. They must be discovered through experience, and each mistake brings you closer to becoming another shadow frozen in the woodwork. Rule 1. Never trust the locks. Daniel discovered this during his second hour of captivity, after the sun had finally set outside the windows. In his desperate search for any mechanism of escape, he'd noticed what appeared to be a lock on the door to what might have been a bedroom. The tarnished brass fixture looked old but functional, complete with a keyhole that suggested a key must exist somewhere in the cabin. He spent precious time searching for that key, tearing through drawers and cupboards that moments before had seemed empty. And then he found it, hanging on a hook beside the fireplace, so obvious he felt foolish for missing it. The key fit the lock perfectly. The mechanism turned with a smooth click that seemed to promise answers. But when Daniel opened the door, he found himself staring at the exact same room he'd just left. Same fireplace, same chairs, same windows showing the darkening forest. He'd opened a door and found himself looking at himself from behind, standing in a room that should have been on the other side of a wall. He slammed the door shut and stumbled backward, his mind trying to process the spatial impossibility. The cabin contained rooms that led to themselves, spaces that folded in ways that three-dimensional reality couldn't accommodate. This was the cabin's first lesson. Exploration would be punished with disorientation, with the breakdown of basic understanding about how spaces should relate to each other. Rule 2. The fire is a lie, but heat is death. This seems contradictory, and that's intentional. The fireplace burns continuously, flames dancing across logs that never diminish, never crumble to ash. The fire produces light and the sound of crackling wood, but no warmth. Survivors learn quickly not to waste time huddling near it. But here's where the rule becomes truly sinister. Sometimes, unpredictably, the fire will begin to radiate actual heat. Warmth will spill into the room, delicious and tempting after hours of freezing cold. Dr. Patricia Valdez nearly died when this happened during her imprisonment. I was so pulled I couldn't feel my feet anymore, and then suddenly there was heat coming from the fireplace, real heat I could feel on my face. I almost ran to it, almost pressed myself against those stones to absorb every bit of warmth I could. But something stopped me. Maybe instinct, maybe I saw something move in the flames. Whatever the reason, I held back. She watched as the heat intensified, growing from comfortable to overwhelming. The temperature in the room spiked from -18 Celsius to over 30 degrees in less than a minute. The windows began to fog, moisture appeared on the walls, and in that artificial warmth, Patricia saw them, the shapes Michael Torres had described, the absorbed victims pressed into the wood. They became visible in the heat, their forms pushing against the grain as if trying to break free. Their mouths opened in silent screams, warning her away from the false comfort. The heat lasted maybe 5 minutes, then it was gone, and the cold came back worse than before. But I understood. The cabin was testing me, offering mercy that was really a trap. If I'd gone to that fire, If I'd let that heat touch me, I would have joined them in the walls. I'm certain of it. Rule 3. Time is measured in breaths, not minutes. Every survivor reports the same phenomenon. Their watches stop inside the cabin, but biological time continues at an altered rate. Your body ages, your heart beats, your cells metabolize and die, but the relationship between internal experience and external reality becomes completely detached. What's worse is that the cabin seems to adjust this ratio based on your mental state. Thomas Chen documented this effect with meticulous detail. He counted his heartbeats, used them as a clock since his watch had stopped. He estimated that his heart beat approximately 100,000 times during his subjective experience in the cabin. At his normal resting heart rate, that would suggest roughly 24 hours had passed. But when he escaped and checked his car's dashboard, only 14 hours had elapsed since he'd entered the cabin. His heart had been beating faster, pushed by fear and cold, making his internal clock run too quickly. But others report the opposite effect. Jennifer Oakes felt certain she'd been trapped for less than 12 hours, but her car showed that 3 full days had passed. Her heartbeat had slowed, dropped into a near hibernation state as her body tried to conserve energy in the deadly cold. The cabin had stretched her perception of time, making hours feel like minutes, while the outside world moved on without her. This temporal distortion serves a purpose. It prevents accurate prediction of rescue. You can't know if help is coming because you can't know how much time has actually passed. The cabin isolates you not just in space, but in time itself, cutting you off from the regular flow of reality. Rule 4. The threshold is a one-way membrane at night. The door that allowed Daniel to enter so easily becomes something else entirely after sunset. Not just locked, but fundamentally altered. Several survivors describe touching the interior surface of the door after dark and feeling it shift under their fingers, becoming less solid, more like touching the surface of very cold water. Press too hard, and your hand begins to sink into it, but not toward the outside world, toward somewhere else, somewhere colder. Rebecca Winters made the mistake of pushing her entire arm through the door's surface during her first night of captivity. It was like plunging my arm into a frozen lake, except there was no water, just cold and darkness, and the sensation of vast space on the other side. I felt something moving in that darkness, something large and slow and ancient. It noticed me. I know it did. When I pulled my arm back, there were frost patterns on my skin that looked almost like handprints. They didn't fade for weeks. The cabin, it seems, doesn't exist in isolation. It's a boundary point, a thin place where something from a realm of absolute cold can almost touch our world. At night, that boundary becomes more permeable, more dangerous. The smart move is to stay away from the walls entirely once darkness falls, to huddle in the center of the room, where at least you're separated from whatever exists on the other side. Rule 5. The cabin is hungry at dawn. This is the most important rule, the one that determines whether you live or die. As morning approaches, as the sun begins to rise in the outside world, the cabin's behavior changes dramatically. The temperature drops even further. The temporal distortion intensifies. Survivors describe feeling a pulling sensation, as if the building itself is trying to absorb them before the chance for escape arrives. This is when the cabin feeds most actively. This is when it tries hardest to keep you. The shadows in the walls become more animated, more desperate. They press against the wood, reaching for you with hands that can almost break through. The air becomes thick, resistant, making every movement feel like wading through invisible water. Your thoughts slow, your body weakens. The cold becomes less painful and more seductive, whispering promises of rest and peace if you'll just stop fighting and let yourself become part of the structure. Fighting this final assault requires strength most people don't have left after a night of freezing, temporal confusion, and psychological torment. But fight you must, because this is also when escape becomes possible. The cabin's rules state that it must release you at dawn, but only if you've survived according to its terms, only if you've played the game correctly. And here's the final cruelty. The cabin teaches you its rules through punishment and near-death experiences, but it never confirms that you've learned them correctly. You can only know you understood by surviving to tell the tale. For every person who escaped, how many others failed to grasp the rules in time? How many shadows frozen in those walls represent those who almost understood, who died still trying to figure out the pattern? The cabin is a puzzle box designed by something that thinks in dimensions we can't perceive, operating on logic that shouldn't exist. It traps and tests and feeds, and whether you live or die depends entirely on your ability to learn impossible rules in circumstances designed to prevent clear thought. It's a perfect trap, almost, because some people do escape, and those survivors carry the rules with them, warning others even though nobody ever believes until it's too late.
Dr. James Reeves doesn't believe in ghosts, but he spent the last 3 years trying to explain something that shouldn't exist. As a theoretical physicist specializing in quantum mechanics and dimensional theory, he's built his career on finding rational explanations for seemingly impossible phenomena. The phantom cabin has become his obsession, and his findings suggest that what survivors experienced might be even stranger than supernatural haunting. Let's start with the temperature drop, Reeves explains, pulling up data on his laptop screen. Every documented encounter begins with an instantaneous decrease of 35 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit. That's not meteorologically possible. Air temperature changes gradually, governed by thermodynamics and atmospheric pressure systems. What survivors describe violates basic principles of heat transfer. His research led him to examine satellite weather data from dates and locations where phantom manifestations allegedly occurred. The results were disturbing. In every single case, weather monitoring systems recorded anomalous readings, not just temperature drops, but localized distortions in atmospheric pressure that shouldn't be possible. It's as if a bubble of different physics descended into our reality for a brief period. The sensors couldn't make sense of it. The data gets flagged as equipment malfunction and discarded. But Reeves recovered that discarded data, and the patterns it revealed changed his entire approach to the phenomenon. Imagine space-time as a fabric. Now, imagine that fabric has weak points, places where the threads aren't woven quite as tightly. Under normal conditions, these weak points don't matter, but introduce extreme cold, drop the temperature below a critical threshold, and those weak points can tear, not completely, just enough for something from another dimensional layer to push through. The mathematics supporting this theory are complex, involving quantum field fluctuations and topological defects in spacetime.
But the implications are straightforward. The cabin isn't appearing in our world. It's always there, existing in a parallel space where physics operate slightly differently. Extreme cold creates the conditions for that parallel space to overlay our space, making the cabin temporarily accessible. This explains the temporal distortion, Reeves continues. If the cabin exists in a dimension where time flows at a different rate, then of course survivors would experience time dilation effects. Their bodies are partially in our reality, following our physics, but they're also interacting with the cabin's dimensional framework where different rules apply. The result is biological processes running at one speed while external time passes at another. To test this hypothesis, Reeves partnered with a team of drone operators, waiting for weather conditions that matched historical manifestation patterns. In January 2024, a sudden cold snap in the Pacific Northwest provided the opportunity. They launched infrared-equipped drones into a remote area where two separate manifestations had been reported in previous years. The footage they captured defies easy explanation. At first, the drones showed exactly what should be there: empty forest covered in snow. But as the temperature dropped below -15°C, the infrared readings began to change. Heat signatures appeared in a small clearing, arranged in a rectangular pattern, roughly 12 meters by 8 meters, the dimensions of a cabin. The heat signatures don't make sense, Reeves says, pulling up the enhanced footage. They're negative heat, colder than the surrounding environment, which is already well below freezing. It's like looking at a thermal photograph of a black hole, a region where heat goes to die. And watch what happens when we overlay multiple frames. He plays the footage in rapid succession. The heat-negative pattern intensifies over the course of 20 minutes, becoming more defined, more structured. Individual points resolve into shapes, walls, a chimney, the geometric precision of windows. And then, for just 3 frames of footage, something else appears in the infrared spectrum. There, Reeves freezes the image. Tell me what you see. Inside the heat-negative structure, there's a single warm signature, human-sized, moving. We had no personnel in that area. The nearest hiking trail is 4 miles away, and weather conditions made hiking impossible that night. But someone or something was inside that space, inside a building that doesn't exist in the visible spectrum. Reeves leans back, his expression troubled. The footage was time-stamped. This signature appeared at 3:47 a.m. At 3:51 a.m., exactly 4 minutes later, the entire structure vanished from the infrared reading. Temperature normalized. The forest returned to baseline thermal readings. Whatever it was, it disappeared. But the most unsettling discovery came when Reeves analyzed the thermal data more carefully. The warm signature inside the cabin showed a temperature of approximately 37 degrees Celsius. Human body temperature. If someone was trapped in there that night, they were maintaining normal body heat despite being surrounded by extreme cold. That suggests they were alive, functioning. But here's what keeps me awake at night. We checked missing persons reports for that region. Nobody was reported missing around that date. So either this person escaped and never reported their experience, or he doesn't finish the sentence. He doesn't need to. The alternative is that the signature wasn't human at all, but rather something else using heat to appear human in the infrared spectrum, something that wanted to be seen, to confirm its presence to anyone watching. Reeves' colleague, Dr. Yuki Tanaka, approaches the phenomenon from a different angle. As a quantum physicist, she focuses on the cabin's apparent ability to trap people without physical barriers that conventional methods can breach. The survivors all report that walls and windows are impervious to damage. They can see through the glass, touch it, but can't break it. That suggests we're not dealing with ordinary matter. Her theory involves quantum tunneling and probability field manipulation. In quantum mechanics, particles can sometimes pass through barriers they shouldn't be able to cross. It's called tunneling, and it happens because particles exist as probability waves until observed. What if the cabin's structure exists in a state of engineered quantum certainty? The walls are there with a probability of 100%, making them impossible to disrupt because they're not really matter in the traditional sense. They're collapsed probability waves, locked into a single state. This would explain why tools and weapons fail to damage the cabin structure. You can't break something that exists as pure mathematical certainty. You can't force your way through walls that are fundamentally guaranteed to be solid by quantum law. But if the cabin is a dimensional intrusion stabilized by quantum manipulation, what creates it? What intelligence or force is capable of engineering such a precise trap? Reeves has a theory about that too, though he admits it ventures into speculation that makes his academic peers uncomfortable. Consider the possibility that this isn't a trap in the predatory sense. What if it's more like a defensive mechanism? Something from a dimension of extreme cold. Something that exists where absolute zero is the natural state, finds itself interacting with our reality when temperatures drop low enough. From its perspective, our world is unbearably hot, even at -20 Celsius. The cabin might be a protective structure, a place where this entity can exist comfortably while maintaining the lethal cold it requires. The problem, of course, is that what serves as comfortable shelter for a being from a frozen dimension becomes a death trap for humans. We're incompatible forms of life trying to occupy the same space. The cabin drains our heat because from the entity's perspective, we're dangerous heat sources contaminating its environment. It's not malicious, it's just trying to survive, the same way we are. The tragedy is that our mutual survival requirements are mutually exclusive. This theory gains support from the testimony of survivors who report feeling watched, feeling a presence in the cabin with them. Not malevolent exactly, more like curious, observing. Michael Torres's claim about hearing footsteps above him might not be a hallucination, but rather an accurate perception of an entity moving through its own dimensional space, its movements bleeding through into our reality as sound without visible source. The question that haunts Reeves is whether communication might be possible. If the cabin is a structure created by something intelligent, could that intelligence be reasoned with? Could it be made to understand that it's killing people? He's proposed attempting controlled contact during the next confirmed manifestation. We'd use thermal cameras and quantum sensors to try to map the entity's presence, maybe establish some form of dialogue. The Ethical Review Board denied my proposal immediately. Too dangerous, too speculative. They're probably right.
But still, if we could just make contact, just explain.
He trails off, staring at the frozen infrared image on his screen. A heat signature shaped like a person standing in a building that shouldn't exist. The cabin feeds on our thermal energy. Every survivor reports feeling drained, weakened, as if the very life is being pulled out of them. But what if that's not consumption? What if it's more like sampling, testing, trying to understand what we are? The implications of this idea are both hopeful and terrifying. Hopeful because it suggests the deaths might be unintentional, the result of misunderstanding rather than predation. Terrifying because it means there's an intelligence behind the phenomenon, something capable of thought and choice, something that continues to manifest the cabin despite knowing, or at least having the capacity to know, that it kills people. Until we understand what created the cabin and why, we can't predict when or where it will appear next, Reeves concludes. All we can do is monitor temperature patterns, watch for anomalies, and hope that anyone caught in a manifestation remembers the rules that previous survivors learned. Because those rules, inexplicable as they are, represent our only accumulated knowledge about how to coexist temporarily with something from a physics framework we barely understand. They're survival instructions for navigating a space where the laws of our reality stop applying. He closes his laptop and adds quietly, "And every time the temperature drops below a certain threshold, somewhere in the remote wilderness, those laws are being rewritten again." Daniel Voss discovered the final rule at 5:47 a.m., though his watch had stopped hours earlier and he could only estimate the time by the faint lightening of the sky visible through the windows. He'd been trapped in the cabin for what felt like 3 days, though he'd long since stopped trusting his perception of time's passage. His body was shutting down. His fingers had gone numb, then his toes, and now the numbness was creeping up his limbs with methodical inevitability. The shadows in the walls had become more active as dawn approached. They pressed against the wood grain, faces twisted in expressions that might have been warning or might have been hunger. The temperature had dropped even further, past the point where Daniel's cheap thermometer could register. His breath came in shallow gasps, each inhalation sending ice crystals through his lungs. He was going to die here. He'd accepted that truth somewhere around the second subjective night, when his exhaustion had almost convinced him to sleep in one of the beds despite every instinct screaming not to. He'd stayed awake through pure stubbornness, pacing the main room in endless circles, keeping his body moving even as it begged for rest. But now, with dawn approaching, his legs could barely support his weight. That's when the final message revealed itself. Daniel collapsed against the wall, his vision swimming, and found himself staring at the wood grain inches from his face. The patterns in the timber seemed to shift and flow, and suddenly he could read them. Not words exactly, but understanding that bloomed in his oxygen-starved brain with the clarity of revelation. The cabin wanted him cold. Not dead, but cold, empty of heat, compatible with its frozen dimension. Every instinct screamed against this understanding. Getting colder meant dying. Hypothermia was killing him already. Accelerating the process seemed like suicide. But the shadows in the walls weren't hostile. They were trapped, yes, absorbed into the structure, but they were trying to help. They'd been human once, and some remnant of that humanity remained. They were showing him what they'd learned too late. Warmth was the trap. Body heat was what the cabin fed on, what it used to strengthen the barrier between dimensions.
The more heat you generated, the more solid the walls became, the more impossible escape grew. But if you could make yourself cold, genuinely cold, reduce your thermal signature to match the cabin's frozen dimension, you became something the cabin couldn't quite grip. You slipped between the rules because you were no longer playing by the physics that bound you here. Daniel forced himself to his feet. Every piece of clothing he wore was designed to retain heat, to keep him alive in extreme cold. He began removing layers, his jacket first, letting it fall to the floor, then his sweater, his thermal underwear. He stripped down until he wore only the minimum necessary to maintain a shred of modesty, and the cold that hit his exposed skin was so intense it stopped feeling like cold. It became pure sensation, overwhelming and absolute. His core temperature began to plummet immediately. He could feel it happening, his body's desperate attempt to maintain heat failing against the extreme environment. His heart rate slowed, his breathing became shallow. The shadows in the walls pulled back slightly, and for the first time since entering the cabin, Daniel felt the structure's attention shift away from him. He was disappearing from its perception, becoming thermally invisible. The front door was still smooth wood on the inside, still lacking any handle or mechanism, but when Daniel pressed his freezing hand to it now, something different happened. The surface didn't feel quite as solid. There was give to it, a slight flexibility that hadn't existed before. He pushed harder, and his fingers began to sink into the wood. Not toward another room, not toward the dark, frozen space Rebecca Winters had described, toward outside, toward the forest and the world where physics operated normally and doors were doors instead of dimensional membranes. Daniel threw his weight against the door, and suddenly he was falling through it. The resistance was minimal, like pushing through a curtain of ice-cold water. For a moment, he existed in both spaces simultaneously, feeling the cabin's dimension and his own overlapping in ways that made his brain scream with incomprehension. Then he was through, tumbling onto frozen ground, into air that felt almost warm compared to the cabin's interior. He didn't look back, couldn't look back. His body was in critical condition, hypothermia well advanced, and he had maybe minutes to get warm before his core temperature dropped below survivable levels. Daniel crawled toward his backpack, which still sat where he'd dropped it hours or days ago. His fingers barely functioned, but he managed to activate the emergency beacon and wrap himself in the thermal blanket from his survival kit. The helicopter found him 3 hours later, guided by the beacon's signal. His core temperature was 28 degrees Celsius, well into severe hypothermia territory. The medics said it was a miracle he was alive, that anyone found in his condition should have been dead. They asked what happened, where he'd been. Daniel tried to explain about the cabin, but the words came out confused and jumbled. They chalked it up to hypothermia-induced confusion and focused on saving his life. When search and rescue went back to find the cabin he'd described, they found nothing. The clearing existed exactly where Daniel said it would be, but it was empty. No structure, no disturbance in the snow beyond Daniel's own tracks, which showed him approaching the clearing, then lying still for several hours before crawling toward his backpack. As far as the physical evidence showed, he'd simply stopped in an empty clearing and nearly frozen to death. But Daniel knew what he'd experienced. The frostbite scars on his fingers and toes were real. The permanent sensitivity to cold that would plague him for the rest of his life was real. And when he finally returned home 3 weeks later, he found something in his jacket pocket that made his blood freeze. A piece of wood,
Dark timber carved with a single word in letters that looked like they'd been scraped by desperate fingernails. The word was sorry. The cabin keeps its victims' belongings. It shouldn't have returned anything to Daniel. Unless something inside the cabin, some remnant of someone who'd been absorbed, wanted him to know, wanted him to carry proof that he wasn't crazy, that the experience was real, wanted someone in the outside world to understand and warn others. Over the following months, Daniel compiled every account he could find. Rebecca Winters, Thomas Chen, Dr. Patricia Valdez, Michael Torres, Jennifer Oakes. He reached out to each of them, and slowly a support network formed. Survivors who understood, who believed each other because they'd all seen the same impossible truths. They created a warning system, monitoring weather patterns and temperature forecasts for regions where manifestations had occurred before. They couldn't predict exactly when or where the cabin would appear next, but they could identify high-risk conditions and alert hiking communities. Most people ignored the warnings. How could they not? The story sounded absurd. But a few listened. A few stayed home when temperatures dropped below the critical threshold. And occasionally someone would message the group to say thank you, that they'd been planning to hike in conditions that matched the warning criteria but had changed their minds. Maybe those people would have been fine, probably even. The cabin doesn't appear every time the temperature drops. But maybe they would have found themselves stepping into a clearing and seeing a welcoming structure that shouldn't exist. Maybe they would have opened a door that closed behind them with terrible finality. Maybe they would have become one more shadow frozen in the woodwork, one more person whose disappearance would be attributed to exposure or poor planning, rather than something that exists in the spaces between realities. Dr. James Reeves continues his research, getting closer to understanding the quantum mechanics that might explain the phenomenon. Dr. Yuki Tanaka has begun developing theoretical models for how dimensional barriers might be strengthened or weakened. They're working toward a future where maybe, just maybe, they can predict manifestations accurately enough to warn people away. But until then, the rules remain the only reliable defense. Keep moving. Don't trust the fire's heat. Never speak names aloud. Stay away from the walls at night. And if you find yourself trapped, if all else fails, remember Daniel Voss's discovery. The cabin feeds on warmth, so make yourself cold, dangerously cold. Cold enough that your body becomes something between living and not, compatible with the frozen dimension long enough to slip through its barriers. It's counterintuitive, it's potentially fatal, it's the only way out. The cabin is still out there. It manifests when conditions align, when temperature and physics and dimensional barriers reach the perfect confluence. It traps, it feeds, it absorbs those who fail to understand its rules, and it waits, patient and eternal, in a reality adjacent to our own. So check the forecast, monitor the temperature, and if you're hiking in remote wilderness and feel the air suddenly turn impossibly cold, if you see a welcoming cabin appear in a clearing where no structure should exist, remember what the survivors learned at such terrible cost. The warm shelter is the deadliest trap of all. Sometimes the only way to survive the cold is to embrace it completely, to make yourself part of the frozen world long enough to escape back to warmth and life. The choice, when the moment comes, is simple but brutal. Freeze to death fighting the cold, or freeze almost to death by accepting it. One path leads to becoming another shadow in the walls. The other leads to survival, marked forever by the experience of touching a reality humans were never meant to enter.
Daniel checks the weather forecast every morning. He lives in Arizona, where sub-zero temperatures almost never occur. He tells himself it's about building a new life in warmth and sunlight. But late at night, when insomnia keeps him awake, he admits the truth. He's running from the possibility that the cabin might appear again, that he might find himself once more having to make the choice between impossible options, between deaths that come in different forms. The piece of wood with "sorry" carved into it sits on his desk, a reminder, a warning, a promise from someone who didn't escape that at least one person made it out. At least one person survived to tell the story. And maybe that's enough. Maybe passing along the rules, warning others, honoring the memory of those who became part of the frozen structure, that's the purpose Daniel was meant to serve. He survived not just for himself, but to be a voice for those still trapped in walls of ice and wood and impossible physics. The cabin is waiting. It will always be waiting. But now, at least, some people know to wait back, to avoid the conditions that summon it, to spread the knowledge that in extreme cold, the greatest danger isn't always the weather itself. Sometimes the shelter that promises salvation while delivering something far worse. An eternity frozen between dimensions, conscious enough to warn, but powerless to escape. Another set of eyes watching from the woodwork as new victims stumble through doors that close with the weight of dimensional finality. Don't trust the map when the mercury plummets. Don't trust the cabin when it appears. And if you find yourself trapped inside, remember, the only way out is through the cold itself. Make yourself part of the frozen world. Become what the cabin expects, and then, just before your body gives up entirely, push through the dimensional membrane and pray you land somewhere warm enough to bring you back to life. The survivors are waiting to hear your story, waiting to add your testimony to the collected knowledge that might save the next person, waiting to confirm that the rules work, that understanding can triumph over impossible physics. All you have to do is survive long enough to tell them.